There's still major political challenges. There's still major issues around the distribution of funds. There's still major issues in Congress around additional funding needed for the rebuilding. My predecessor at the Institute did a major paper on the role of the churches and faith-based institutions in recovery, and it really has been astonishing. And I'm talking about all faiths here in terms of the rebuilding of the city and the rebuilding of the region, because I really have to pay attention to both Katrina and Rita, which hit a couple of weeks later and just to the west of New Orleans. So the damage is kind of from kind of the state line or a little bit into Texas all the way over through Mississippi and over to the edge of Alabama. But a lot is going on. Thank you for asking about that. And a lot still needs to be going on. And we still have people coming in to work. It's wonderful. And at Loyola, the new freshman class, which is our biggest class since Katrina, and it's actually, the immediate pre-Katrina class was the largest we'd ever had of some 800 freshmen. This group, I think, is 790 freshmen and 120 transfers. What's interesting is that so many of these students have indicated on surveys that I think 2/3 of the students said part of the reason they've come to Loyola is to help rebuild the city and the region. And what I don't know yet, and we've asked for this data, is how many of these students came in as high school students and helped to rebuild for spring semester after spring break after spring break, and then said, I want to go back and help rebuild the city. So there's a lot going on, and will continue to go on. Our own institute is sponsoring a conference in early November, and we'll start on migration worldwide, but we're going to start with the Katrina experience. So the first sessions are on Katrina, then it's migration in the South, and then it's migration in the U.S., and then it's worldwide migration. But we want to be able to connect people to the experience. And so we have people talking about, former students and employees, about their own experience of being internally displaced people, which is what the technical phrase is, including I was myself and our staff from our province. We spent 5 months out of the city because our offices were flooded. So thanks for asking, but it's where the church has been very good. There's been a lot of wonderful, but so have many faith communities, and this is the churches in the public square, and this is, the Pope would say, this is direct participation in the rebuilding of society.
Welcome to Cleveland, Father.
Thank you.
You spoke in terms of the Pope's encyclical about the common sense, the common ground, if you will, and the idea of looking into the future and making sure that it's done for society's good. And when one looks at the wonderful vibrance of New Orleans before August of 2005 and Katrina, and one looks at what happened afterward and where we are, in the rebuilding of New Orleans, how does the common ground and the common social good come when viewed into the future, when perhaps there are needs and the environmental and or the larger systemic issues that, as you put it, caused that man-made disaster in New Orleans? And how do we address that within the concept of not merely rebuilding a house, but looking at which areas need to be and should be reclaimed and which ones we perhaps ought to let get back to nature?
Yeah. I'm not an expert on the environmental issues. Let me just address kind of systemic and structural issues that would get at what you're talking about, and I'll come back to environment. First, one of the things that was part of the problem in the past was we had multiple levee boards on different parts of our coasts. And a bill went in the Louisiana legislature the next year, this is about structural change, to have a single levee board for the whole state of Louisiana. Well, in the world of political compromise, we ended up with two, one east of the Mississippi, one west of the Mississippi, but at least we reduced it from 7 or 10 to 2. Secondly, we had 7 assessors. So property was assessed at different values all across the city. And one of the dilemmas that homeowners found is while they might have had low assessments and low property taxes, their insurance was queued to their property value as the assessment had set it. So when it came time to rebuild, they found out that the cost of rebuilding their home wasn't covered by their insurance. And so we went from 7 assessors, this again was a piece of structural and political change, to 1 assessor, which is the beginning of trying to move towards fair and just assessment across the community. So those have been very important pieces of our rebuilding. The other thing is that the legislation had been passed about having a inspector general for the city. So this addresses the corruption issue. And it had never been implemented. And actually the new board, which was put in place, was the presidents of the universities. And the chair of the board is the president of Loyola University of New Orleans, Father Kevin Wiles. And they've hired an inspector general who unfortunately developed cancer, et cetera. But the beginning of a number of indictments and corruption investigations has come out of that office. And the new inspector general to replace him was hired last week. That's another structural and systemic change. In terms of the environment, the Diocese actually of Houma-Thibodeau, which is down below us along the Gulf, their Office of Justice and Peace and Catholic Charities has been active around wetlands issue, because if you know the issue, there are many ways in which entrenchments have come into the wetlands. Drilling for oil, canals were dug, salt water came in. We built levees, and so you didn't get the spring overflow of earth really back into those wetlands. So wetlands deteriorated, and that enabled Katrina to move in with a greater wall of water. That dice has been lobbying for years because, as their director of Catholic Charities, Rob Gorman, says, he knows somebody who's fishing where his grandfather farmed. And so there's been a lot more energy now around the wetlands and groups working on that as well. And I'd say those are 4 areas where it's the structural and systemic that have to be addressed. We have not had the political courage, to be frank, to say that we're not redeveloping any area. And that's part of our political failing and the failure of our political leadership. So rebuilding has ended up being market-driven, where people could get the money, where they had the money. And so that's why rebuilding is better, obviously, in better-off neighborhoods than it is in poorer neighborhoods. But there are parts of the city that maybe we should never built in the first place, and we have not made that decision.
I'm going to stand up. Good afternoon. Thank you for your talk. I regret that I haven't read the encyclical. My question is kind of a broader question about the encyclical, and this theme might be in there, so I apologize if it is. But when you go through the different themes that Pope Benedict has touched on, one of the tensions that I see that you didn't really address is, for example, the United States spends 57% of its budget on the military. And we have, according to economist Singlets, $1 trillion debt, and that estimate was 3 years ago just for Iraq. And all the other hidden costs and the military-industrial complex that continues to force us to make choices, I think, that are unethical and immoral. But the church seems to always kind of dance around this relationship, and the Catholics that push the life issue from the nonviolence perspective are largely marginalized and not embraced. And I was wondering if Pope Benedict believes that good conquers evil, can we continue to hang on to the not speaking to the militarization of our country and other countries and using military means as a resolving conflict and distribution of resources?
Thank you. It's a wonderful question. He's not as clear in this one as he is clear that the industrialized nations need to take on a greater burden in terms of human development around the world. I don't remember, as I say, it's over 30,000 words. It's really like reading a paperback book. I don't remember the direct connection back to armaments. The tradition has certainly done that. The encyclicals of the last 50 years have made it very clear that there is a connection between economic development and arms in 2 directions. The earlier articulation, this would go back 40 years ago, was that if we don't deal with the problem of poverty in the world, then violence will result from that. That was the first way it was articulated. Then later, especially in the writing of Pope John Paul II, it was that the divergence of human resources into armaments, and it wasn't just money, it was money and energy and scientific technology. If we took just an example, the scientific technology to develop better nuclear weapons and used it to develop better mass transit, better social services, etc., the Pope claimed that divergence into, especially in his 1989 encyclical, that the East-West conflict, or earlier in the 80s, the East-West conflict had diverted human resources in a terrible way into that conflict. And what he called the proxy wars that the USSR and the United States were conducting around the world, in Latin America and Africa and Asia, etc. And so the tradition has clearly made the connection between economic development and arms. In fact, Paul VI said another word for peace is human development. I mean, and that we're not going to have peace in the world until we deal with the question of human development for peoples. Until people get what's called the common good, to go back to the observation, until there is work towards the common good, which, as you heard from the Catholic Catechism, is the good of all of us. And no one's going to achieve their own good, really, fully integral good, without everybody. And that's what solidarity would say in terms of the world today. But you're right. The tradition has clearly, and it's not as strong a point in this one. He really is covering, as you heard, about 50 issues.